So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment and why it is so important in the history of design. When we think about the Enlightenment, one of the areas that we have to think about is this increase in the printed word, and that is increase in printing and also industrial improvements in printing, and how prior to the Gutenberg press, we're looking at a large segment of the population that is illiterate. Once we have writing available to a large number of people, we start to see people thinking for themselves. We have a large number of illustrated works, fiction, drama, poetry, and other information around the advance of engineering and science, and all of those things are happening at this time. One of the people that we want to look at is Denis Diderot, or Denis Diderot. He is educated in France in 1732. He earns a Master of Arts degree in philosophy. He originally wants to go into the clergy, but then decides to study law, and that also is very short-lived, and he decides to become a writer. Not very happy in terms of his relationship with his family. They didn't like this idea. He lives somewhat of a bohemian existence and befriends a gentleman by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1742. He is a prominent philosopher in the Enlightenment. He's an art critic and a writer. He lives to the age of 70, dies in 1784. A key Enlightenment figure, of course, was his idea of the avant-garde, and he foreshadows many of the concepts of things that we know now in modern science. He definitely was not a practicing scientist, but he was as close as you could get. His first major publication was a translation and commentary on the English Medical Dictionary. Later, he declared, "There are few words I read with more pleasure than medical works." He also spent several years attending the chemistry lectures of Rouelle, one of France's most prominent chemists. Excuse me. And later, he introduces an impressive unfinished work, 15 years in the making of the elements of physiology. André Breton, a bookseller and a printer, approaches Diderot with a project for the publication of an encyclopedia. It's called the Cyclopedia, or Universal Dictionary of Arts and Sciences. And this is undertaken originally by John Mills and then followed by the German Gottfried Cilius, but Diderot accepts the proposal, and during this translation, his creative mind and astute vision transform the work. Instead of just a mere reproduction, he persuades Le Breton to enter upon a new work which would collect all the active writers, ideas, and knowledge that were moving the cultivated class of the Republic of Letters to its depths, but were comparatively ineffectual due to their dispersion. His enthusiasm for the project was transmitted to the publishers, and they collected a sufficient capital to be able to move upon the enterprise. Diderot's colleague eventually gets permission, and they secure that from the government. And in 1750, he has an elaborate prospectus that he announces, and the public is absolutely delighted. And by 1751, the first volume is published. This work was quite unorthodox and had many forward-thinking ideas for the time. He stated in this work that an encyclopedia ought to make good the failure to execute such a project hitherto, and should encompass not only the fields already covered by the academics, but each and every branch of human knowledge. So really, this is kind of the beginning of this age of knowledge. So with the idea of the printed press, the moving of the industry for press, and then the ideas of Diderot, we start to see that it's a way to change how people think. So he says in this encyclopedia, the power to change men's common way of thinking, it's very important to him. This idea was profound. It was one of the first works during the Enlightenment. Diderot wanted to give all the people the ability to further their knowledge and hence by doing that, be able to make decisions. In a sense, he would allow every person to have any knowledge that they sought in the world. This is very much like the way we think about computers and Google and being able to search anything we want at any given time, not having to go to a library, not even to be limited by books. So this is very forward thinking. Academies in their respective fields thought that their proficiency in their trade was really all they needed, but he thought it would be better to bring all of this idea together and, condense it into this form. So from the beginning, his work was plagued by controversy. The project was suspended by the courts in 1752. Just after the second volume was completed, accusations arose regarding seditious content concerning the editor's entries on religion and natural law, because he put in things that were, somewhat controversial. Diderot was detained and his house was searched for his manuscripts. The search provided no manuscripts. They had already been hidden in a house of someone who was an unlikely friend, a very high official. Although the person that he hid the manuscripts with, this man by the name of Malesherbes, he was an absolute loyalist to the monarchy, but he was sympathetic to this literary project. And so with his support and some other well-placed influential friends, the project resumed, and Diderot continued his efforts to be, to make this happen. But his efforts always were controversial. So in the circle of leaders of the Enlightenment, Diderot's name became known as the letter for his letters, which supported Locke's theory about knowledge. He attacked the conventional morality of the day, with the result was that he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned for 3 months. He was released because of a friend of Voltaire's, Madame Châtelet, had a close relationship with all the revolutionary leaders, and so she helped him get out. In the end, in 1765, the library was purchased and assigned him a yearly salary that was through Catherine of Russia, and she paid him for 50 years in advance. So his position gradually changed from theism to deism, and then to materialism, and finally rested in what is called pantheistic sensualism. Excuse me. And so here we have the public occurrences, both foreign and domestic, was the first multi-page newspaper that was published in the Americas. Before then, a single-page newspaper broadsides were published in the English colonies and printed in Cambridge in 1689. The first published edition was in September 25th of 1690. Again, we start to see a lot of different things being printed. Here we have William Playfair, the Scottish engineer and political economist. He's publishing diagrams in 1786. Here we see one of the first line graphs that's used. Again, just this sort of deluge of information, not just written word, but scientific information, religious information. It just, it was like an avalanche, if you will. So when we get to printing now, we're starting to look at a big difference between what had happened pre-press, which would have been the black letter print, to what we now call Roman typeface. And these were developed in France expressly by the order of King Louis XIV. In 1692, he directed that a typeface be designed for all necessary type for the royal printer. And the design was the work of several years of work by different members during this time. It was originally, and then it was cut by Philippe Grandjean. William Caslon, another important person in terms of type. He was an English gunsmith and designer of typefaces. He was born in Worcestershire and started a business in London as an engraver. And he also he engraved gun locks and barrels, and also he created bookbinding tools. And he had a lot of contact with printers through that, and so he set up his own type foundry, largely through the encouragement of William Boyer. And what he was concerned about was legibility. And so the typefaces that he inspired were very legible. The Caslon faces, as we can see here in the screen print. His work was influenced then by John Baskerville and other printers of the time. And it was considered very modern. Caslon typefaces were immediately popular and used by many printers, and his works were also imported into the United States. We can see them in a printed version of the United States Declaration of Independence. Caslon type became so popular that the expression about typeface choice, when in doubt, was to use Caslon. Caslon types fell out of favor in the century after his death in the 1840s, but today we see Caslon type as a widely used type and very popular. Another type designer during this time was Bodoni. Here's a series of typefaces first designed by him in 1798. The typeface is classified as a Didion modern. So Bodoni followed the ideas of John Baskerville as founded in the printing type of Baskerville, and that of the increased stroke and more vertical, slightly condensed uppercase letters, but taking them to a more extreme conclusion. Bodoni had a long career, and his designs evolved and differed, ending with a typeface of a narrower underlying structure with flat, unbracketed serifs, extreme contrast between thick and thin strokes, and an overall geometric construction. Later designs, rightfully called modern, the earlier designs are somewhat transitional. Among digital versions, there are two very good examples of the transitional period in what's known as the Sumner Stone ITC Bodoni, and then later the modern version, which is the Gunther Long's Bodoni Old Face for Berthold. Virtually all the versions are based on Bodoni's later manner. So graphics effects of the Industrial Revolution. So now we've kind of looked at this idea of thought and the need to like push ideas about knowledge of all areas. And then also, what happens as we move into the Industrial Revolution between 1800 and 1850. So the industrialization of print production expanded graphic and typographic vocabularies. Promotional use of printed images helped produce mass markets and a new visual culture, which we hadn't seen before. Publications served to mediate social values across readership and classes to unprecedented degrees. Literacy rates grew at an alarming rate for people who were in charge because people could now ask questions. And it increased, what happened is we ended up with a very educated workforce. Lithography and photography altered the aesthetic and conceptual codes of imagery, and printed images assumed social and practical functions in education, entertainment, politics, and science. And mass-produced graphic media became objects of consumption all on their own. And it looked at this kind of line between commercial art and then fine art and started to blur that line, because now we start to see graphic design in modern visual culture rather than just fine art. And that includes like the images like this of posters. This is an 1845 poster of Henri de Balzac's Petites Miseries, The Little Miseries of Married Life. Serves as a valuable example of multiple aspects that are still integrated into graphic design today. During the time of industrialization technology, we're looking at, this literacy and the middle class. So the need for cheap and efficient means of transmitting visual information gave rise to a new title, which would be the communication designer, graphic designer that we have today. The poster exists in society as both an ephemeral object and a collectible piece of art, just as the early designer was seen as a tradesman and eventually became an artist. The poster consists of central image depicting a man who struggles to maintain balance as he supports the weight of his family, who happily piles on top of him, no problem. The picture is applied to the poster by using the efficient and cheap methods of lithography we mentioned earlier, and the limited number of color registration creates a clash between highlights and shadows that displays weight and intensity, allowing the image to pop out, and a distinguishable characteristic of early color lithography. The penny magazine or the penny press is another element of visual and literary information that is coming out at this time. Here we have the penny magazine, which was run from March of 1832 to October of 1845. It was an illustrated British magazine for the working class. Charles Knight created it for what he called the diffusion of useful knowledge. I'm going to just kind of move on. Here's another Thomas Hodgkins. He was another writer. This is the Mechanics magazine. He was a free market radical who was one of the first to apply the term capitalist despairingly to the beneficiaries of government favors that were bestowed upon people that were high up in industry and at the expense of people who were laborers. He had a lot of criticism of employers in this magazine, and he ended up influencing a whole generation of people who looked towards unions and social ideas like that, wanted to protect the worker. Those people included people like Karl Marx. He had fundamentalist deist ideas about production and the exchange of labor, that it needed to have a particular value, and that it shouldn't just be taken for granted, and that much of what society was built on the backs of those laborers. So the divinely ordained proper relations of society contrasted to the contrivances, or like what he called the social disharmonies and conflicts. He rejected the natural right of people to own, obviously like workers, and to pay them low. So the Mechanics magazine, which came about in October of 1823, wrote a manifesto that would be more than a technical school, but a place where practical studies could be combined with practical reflection about also the conditions of society. So, in other words, how you worked and how it affected society mattered. Here's a display of poster fonts that were created in 1841 through 1843, which kind of moves us into the next period that I want to talk about, which is the arts and crafts movement. John Ruskin was considered one of the greatest British art critics of and a social commentator of the Victorian age. His ideas inspired what we now know as the arts and crafts movement, and he fiercely attacked the worst aspects of industrialization and actively promoted art education in museums for the working classes. He was born in 1819. He was from a very prosperous family that imported sherry. He was a poet, a writer. He studied geology, and he also knew the Bible intimately. He was a very deeply religious man. Throughout his life, he undertook extended tours of Britain and the continent, and he provided literary works such as the Poetry of Architecture, the Seven Lamps of Architecture, the Stones of Venice, the Bible of Amiens, and more. Throughout his life, he advanced the idea of the working man, and which brings us to the Working Man's College. This was founded in 1854, and it was a way to provide liberal arts and education to skilled laborers who had lost their artisan work because of industrialization. It was closely associated with the cooperative movement and unions, or the guilds of the time. And stemming from the same tradition as the Workers' Educational Association, it was among the first adult education institutes in Britain. Key supporters at this time were F.D. Morris, James Stuart Mill, Tom Hughes, and Charles Kingsley, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and of course, John Ruskin. John Ruskin had some quotes that really mattered when it came to understanding art. He said, "If it is the love of that which your work represents, if being a landscape painter, it is the love of the hills and the trees that moves you, if being a figure painter, it is the love of the human beauty and the human soul that move you. If, being a flower or animal painter, it is the love and the wonder and the delight in the petal and in the limb that move you, then the Spirit is upon you, and the earth is yours, and the fullness thereof. So he really believed that making art was a very religious experience, that it was part of your soul. He developed a close relationship with Rossetti, and they were colleagues together at the Working Men's College in Camden. Which brings us to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a group of artists who were extremely influenced by this idea of arts and crafts and moving away from industrial, like making of all the products in the home and all of this sort of shoddy workmanship to going back to like, handmade craft movements. So when we look at the Pre-Raphaelites, we kind of have to look at them in this idea of like kind of going back in time. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was founded by 3 young students associated with the British Royal Academy of Art. They were John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. These 3 invited 4 of their contemporaries to join them in their brotherhood, and that included William Michael Rossetti, Frederick George Stevens, Thomas Woolner, and Charles Alston Collins. Not all of them were painters. Rossetti's brother, William, was at one time a store clerk. Stevens was an aspiring poet, and Woolner was a sculptor. The original aim of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was to follow John Ruskin's advice in Modern Painters, where he says, "Go to nature in all singleness of heart, and walk with her laboriously and trustingly, having no other thought but how best to penetrate her meaning, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing." So in other words, how do you go there with an open mind and just observe and replicate or try to talk about what you see in terms of the art that you see there without putting your own kind of spin on it? That's what he was trying to get across to them. So the members of the Brotherhood began work on paintings in this line, and plans were made for a literary magazine. They entitled that magazine The Germ, as a showcase for the writings and etchings of the group that were about, obviously, art and poetry. They formed in 1848, and they had a kind of simple idea that painting and poetry were just 2 different ways of expressing the same idea. So they thought that there should be beauty, and it should be about, the same thing that you could express in word, that you would be able to express in images. They wished to correct the false principles on which the arts had been based since the time of Raphael. They thought that beauty had supplanted truth in art, and that a return to the principles of truth and usefulness would create better art. So in that idea, these ideas that they began to paint and to compose poetry with some success, really pushed them to the forefront of British design. Let's take a look at Dante Gabriel Rossetti. His early drawings, and this is a portrait of him, his early drawings were inspired by romantic poetry, dwelt upon supernatural ideas and moral themes. At first, they were heavily shaded. His technique became progressively lighter and flatter and more linear. By 1848, Rossetti and John Millais and William Hunt had all started working and kind of connecting, looking at their work and critiquing their work together. This is one of his early paintings, The Annunciation, and there we see a very different kind of idea as to what the Annunciation would look like. In fact, we don't see her as being absolutely thrilled with the idea. If anything, she's got some reservation. She looks a little fearful. Between them, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood created a new kind of simplified style. They were looking at archaic themes and ways to be expressive. They were inspired very much by the work of the Middle Ages and the early Italian Renaissance. Here's a photo of Rossetti and his brother and his sister and his mother from 1863. This is Dante Rossetti's painting of Beata Beatrix. The picture represents a vision of Dante's Beatrice in at the precise moment of her death in Dante's Inferno. It has a double subject for the principal figure. Both Dante's Beatrice and Elizabeth Seidel, who is the wife of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. The title Blessed Beatrice refers to the end of the Vita Nova. The picture links Seidel, the person literally represented, to Beatrice. The red dove, the messenger of love, was associated by Rossetti with Seidel. It bears a white poppy, a symbol of sleep or death, and the source of laudanum, the cause of Seidel's eventual death. In the background is Dante looking toward her, love. So he's over on the right, and then love is on the left, dressed in red, and holding a flame. The picture, however, is perfectly comprehensible as a simple representation of the early Beatrice.